Hello my beautiful friends, it's Amanda here, and today we're doing a little BYOP with me video, and this time I'm focusing on recreating some fall and Halloween themed palettes. Today we're going to focus on 3 palettes that are very fall themed and have all been discontinued. As far as I'm concerned, these are pretty iconic fall palettes, all of which I have long loved. I've done reviews on the original palette releases and really enjoyed all of these. So it was fun to recreate these palettes that I have so enjoyed, but I can't really recommend anymore because they're not available anymore. You probably already figured out from the title and the thumbnail, but the 3 palettes we're talking about are the Faced Hot Buttered Rum palette, the Faced Original Gingerbread Spice palette, and the first ColourPop Hocus Pocus palette called Gather Round Sisters. If you missed out on any of these palettes, we're going to go through and recreate them today. I'm just going to show you the process of choosing the shades for one of the palettes. That way you can sort of apply my process to any palette that you want to recreate. And then I'll just show you the shades that I came up with for the other 2 palettes and the side-by-side swatches, give you a little rundown of those. Because they are larger palettes, doing the whole process actually ended up taking me a couple hours. That would be kind of a lengthy video. I don't think it would be much fun to watch. It definitely wouldn't be any fun to edit. So we're going to go through the shade selection process for Hot Buttered Rum, and then I'll show you some shade ideas for the other 2 palettes. So let's get started with the Faced Hot Buttered Rum palette. When I'm getting ready to do a palette recreation, the first thing that I grab are some makeup removing wipes because I do a lot of swatching. I also need a little empty magnetic palette so that I can put all of my selected shades together. And then I gather up some of my single shadows. I do like to organize my shadows by shade, and that really makes this process a lot easier for me because I know when I'm looking for a yellow, I can grab my yellow palette. When I'm looking for a pinky mauve, I can grab my pinky mauve palette, and that really helps me to quickly and easily swatch a lot of similar shades together and make my shade selections. And then, of course, the last thing I need is the palette that I'm going to recreate. I do own today's palette, but sometimes I just look at swatches or photos on the internet and I can use that as my reference. But today I am fortunate enough to be recreating a palette that I already own, and that definitely makes the process a lot easier because it's so much easier to pick up on the little subtleties of the finishes and the undertones. And when you look at a frosty white online, you think, hey, it's just a frosty white. But once you start swatching and comparing, some are more golden, some have a more greenish or bluish undertone, some are more shimmery, some are too beige, some are too satiny. So when I have my hands on the actual palette I'm recreating, I feel like I get a much better match overall. However, I do tend to be a lot more picky and take a lot more time to make my selection because I really want to get it as close as humanly possible, and seeing them side by side, it's a lot harder to pull the trigger on a shade for me than just seeing a swatch online and saying, yeah, well, this is close enough. It's just an online picture, right? So a few things about this process that I just want to point out to you so that you can actually apply this in your real life. Instead of just telling you about these shades that I'm swatching on screen, I want to tell you about the process so that you can actually do it. A couple of the things that I've noticed, first of all, the color in the pan is not always what you should go off of. Sometimes you see this shade in a palette and you think, oh, it looks just like whatever single shadow. But once you actually apply them to the skin, they may look very different no matter how similar they look in the pan. So don't just go for that. Sometimes it's the shadow that you never would have picked based on the appearance in the pan, but once you swatch, it's a whole nother story. So just get creative. Nobody's watching you. Even if you are filming yourself like I am, you're going to make a better selection the more things you try. So just swatch a lot, try a lot, and maybe expand your horizons a little bit. Don't just go off of the pan color. My other tip to you is feel free to tweak a palette a little bit if it's not exactly the right fit for you. Maybe you don't have the exact same shade. It's okay. If it's close enough, sometimes they'll give you this exact same look on the eye, even if the shade itself is not quite right. Or maybe there's a certain shade in a palette that you know won't be useful to you. For me, it's a pressed glitter. When I recreate a palette, I like to put a metallic or a duochrome or something in place of a pressed glitter because I don't like pressed glitters. I don't use them. Maybe for you, it's a matte black or one of these little bone colored matte shades or whatever it may be. You're allowed to tweak your recreation to be something that you're actually going to love, maybe even more than the original, and that's great. It's all about just flexing that creative muscle and putting to use the things that you already have in your collection. This same idea could also be used to adjust a palette that you really like the color story, but you think maybe the tones won't work well for your skin tone. You can take the same color story and recreate it to be lighter or deeper or warmer or cooler and use that blueprint of a color story that's been laid out, but recreate it with shades that you think are going to suit your undertone or your skin tone better. And you're still recreating it, and you're even making a new generation that works better for you. It's all about just having fun, playing with the shades that you already have, or if you do happen to purchase new single shadows or purchase Super Shock shadows or something, and you're not quite sure how to integrate those into your daily use, then using an existing palette, doing a build your own palette recreation can be a great way to inspire you to use those shades and to come up with some color combinations that maybe you wouldn't have on your own if you just plopped them into whatever free space you had instead of using an existing palette to sort of curate a collection of shadows. The last shade in this palette is this really pretty orangey, mustardy type of shade. I think it looks more of a mustard color in the pan of this palette, but when you see it swatched, it definitely pulls more orange on the skin. And this is the perfect example of what I was talking about with not letting the color in the pan fool you, because you'll see me first swatch this with some of these golden orangey type of single shadows, and I really feel like I found the right match amongst this crowd. But I wanted to swatch Paper Tiger here because that was the first one that came to my mind when I saw this Hot Buttered Rum yellow shade in the pan. But when you see them swatched here side by side, they look nothing alike. The oranges are a much better match than this golden yellow mustardy Paper Tiger shade, which I do love, by the way. Once I've gone through and done my individual swatches to select the shades, I like to put them all together on my arm so that I can get a feel for if there's anything that's really off or anything that I need to tweak. You'll see from the swatches in this video and many other of my BYOP recreation videos, I don't always have the exact match. And I have a huge collection of single shadows. I have probably hundreds of single shadows. And if you looked through all my palettes, I have literally thousands, tens of thousands of different eyeshadows. And I still can't always make the exact same palette. But all in all, if it's gonna look the same on the eye, then it's close enough. It's, as my husband would say, good enough for government work. It doesn't have to be, in your own experience when you're doing this at home, it doesn't have to be exact. It doesn't have to be a dead-on dupe. Like I said, close enough or even tweaked to fit you better is great. You don't have to worry about being an Instagrammably perfect match. just create something that's fun and that you like. Next up, since we're on a Too Faced roll already, let's talk about the original palette that really started it all for Too Faced's fall releases. This is the Gingerbread Spice palette, the original. This Gingerbread Spice palette was deceptively difficult to dupe in my collection. When you look at this palette, it just seems like a very warm neutral, lots of pinky leaning, and it seems very basic, but when I tell you, it took me hours to swatch and find suitable stand-ins for these. Maybe it's just because I don't have a ton of singles in these shades, but really, I feel like this was a deceptively difficult one. When I pulled this, I thought, oh, it'll be perfect. This will be one that I can easily dupe with my collection. And it was not quite that simple. Now, I do think I came up with a fantastic set of shadows to recreate this color story, but you'll notice they are not exactly the same. Close enough, definitely would look the same on the eye, but I was surprised and kind of pleasantly surprised that this was more of a challenge than I expected. I'm going to show you a close-up shot of the shadows that I selected in case you want to try to pull any of these from your own collection, or maybe if you really just want one or two shades from one of these palettes, you can always pause, take a screenshot, or pause and write down the shades that you're interested in. And I will also list the shadows that I used for my recreations with the brand and the shade names down in the description box as well if you want to take a look down there. I think the photo reference is easier for me personally, but I want to make sure that these shade names are as accessible as possible, and listing them all together in on the swatch like this is really difficult when you have to include the different brand names as well. It can just start to become a little jumbled up mess. But overall, I feel like this recreation was worth all of the time it took to select these shades. It ended up being very, very close. I think some of the pinks are a little bit off, and I did choose something a little bit more reflective and a little bit more of a duochrome to stand in for that olive green shade, and I actually like it a little bit better. I am one for a very shimmery duochrome moment, so that's kind of what I was talking about earlier. When you customize the shades to yourself, you can create something that fits even better with your own personal style. And often the shades that you already own are going to reflect that personal style anyway. So I really like this recreation. I think despite the challenge, it ended up being pretty darn good. Lastly, I can't talk about fall without talking about Halloween, and I can't talk about Halloween without talking about one of my favorite Halloween movies of all time. I'm talking about Hocus Pocus. This was a movie I watched as a kid, and I've loved seeing the whole Hocus Pocus franchise have such a revival. It's really nostalgic. It's really heartwarming. I love it. Yes, I watched Hocus Pocus 2. I loved it too. It was funny, campy, silly, a little silly, spooky good time. I'm always down for that. And I really like the Gather Round Sisters palette, so I'm going to recreate that one for you today since it's no longer available. Now we're going to take a little departure from all of those golden orangey tones, and we're going to take a look at this Gather Round Sisters palette. This is the first ColourPop and Hocus Pocus collaboration palette. This had a lot of mixed reviews. I really liked it, and I continue to like this one. I had a fun time recreating this. Again, this was more challenging than I expected, but I went into this palette knowing that I was going to take some liberties because this does have a really glittery, foily shade, and I knew that I wanted to replace that with just a regular metallic instead because that's just my personal preference. Seeing the shades side by side, the originals and then my recreation, I think they look more different than they do when they're actually swatched. The color in the pans isn't quite as close as the color once it's applied to the skin. Probably no one will be surprised by this, but it is worth noting that a lot of the singles I use to recreate this palette are ColourPop singles, so they basically have already provided you this palette, even though the Gather Round Sisters palette itself is discontinued. I also considered using that same green Terra Moons shade in this palette that I used in the Too Faced Gingerbread Spice recreation, but I ended up going with something a little bit softer that was truer to the original shade, just because I felt like I had already changed so much by changing out the texture of that more glittery shade. So I was trying my best to stay really true to the existing shades. And this one is a bit softer, but I do think that green Terra Moons single shadow would be beautiful in this collection as well. Again, not exactly the same, but pretty darn close. Those are just a few ideas for recreating some of these fall palettes that I really love. Now, I just want to say, I usually say this at the beginning of the videos, but if you've watched any of my other BYOP recreation videos, you've already heard me say this. First of all, the whole point of these videos is not for you to go out and buy all of these single shadows. Many of these shadows may be discontinued or out of stock currently, and really it's not the point, unless there's one shade that you really wanted out of a palette and you're just looking for a match for one shade. That's one thing, but the point is really just to encourage you to use the makeup that you already have, encourage you to look for ways to create color stories that you're drawn to without necessarily having to go out and buy tons of palettes, or in the case of these discontinued palettes, it's sort of to encourage you to avoid buying these on secondhand sites that are either super inflated prices or sometimes they're like knockoff fake products. I really just want to encourage you to enjoy the makeup you have, and maybe it can help you look at things a little bit differently. You don't have to have a huge collection of single shadows to recreate the color stories that you see in palettes that interest you. You can always pull shadows in from other palettes, and you can even use things like your highlighters, your bronzers, your contour shades if you need to fill in. Those things can definitely be used on your eyes too. So I really encourage you to get creative with what you have fun with your makeup that's already in your collection, and if you need to pick up some singles here and there to fill the gaps, hopefully I can help point you in the right direction there. I always have fun doing these. It's great to just dig into my collection and pull out my singles and mix and match them into new palettes. I hope that you had fun. I hope you found a little inspiration here. I would love to hear which palettes you want to see me recreate next. You always come up with great ideas, so I really appreciate that. Keep those comments coming. As always, thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in my next video. Bye! Are these all discontinued? Is Gather Round? I'm sure Gather Round Sisters is, right? Today we're gonna... Don't know what that word was gonna be. Meh. It's not as far as I'm. It's the first one. We can. This little mustardy gold earring with the checkerboard sweater with warm little golden eye is just, I feel like a toasty little fall goddess. Got my little leaves here. Hello Kitty mugs back there. It's still there because I have so many of these that my mug cabinet downstairs is full. And I think my husband was getting a little bit annoyed because he kept just leaving them out on the counter instead of shoving them all into the mug cabinet. So also I should point out that these Hello Kitty mugs, the Halloween ones that I have, are really, they're the really big oversized mugs. So they may be taking up more than their fair share of cabinet space. Potentially. Allegedly. So I just thought I would leave one up here for our enjoyment. Yeah, that was fun. Please don't yell at me if they're out of stock. Please don't do that. Don't do it. It's too early for that. It's too early for yelling. I don't know what time it is where you are, but wherever I am, whatever point you watch this, it's too early for that. Okay, I got some little errands to run. I need some groceries. I gotta edit this video. A parent-teacher conference. Gotta get stuff ready for the post office. Gotta ship some Etsy orders. Oh, these are my Etsy shop. They're in the fall section, but I think I'm going to keep this style year round because I really like them. They're long, but they're so lightweight that you don't even notice the length. At least I don't. I also don't mind wearing long earrings, so I think that's just sort of a personal choice. Okay, thanks for watching. You are just a spectacular, spectacular little friend, and I'm happy you're here. And you're looking pretty adorable today. Okay, I love your face. Bye.